Well, they'll be laying out their cases. The prosecution laid out a very extensive case over 10 days, drawing on everybody from witnesses at the scene to Derek Chauvin's former police colleagues, including, quite remarkably, his own police chief, and a whole host of medical experts who essentially said that the life was crushed out, the breath was crushed out of George Floyd. Derek Chauvin's lawyer gave a much shorter presentation. He had only 2 days of witnesses, and they were perhaps not as persuasive, but both of them will be laying out their cases again. Chauvin's case is essentially, look, what I was doing was within my police training. I was just following, and in any case, whatever it was I was doing is not what killed George Floyd. He had a heart attack because he was using drugs.
Yes, and on that, and you've written extensively about the drugs and the opioid crisis. How convincing were their arguments around his drug taking and how the potential of that to have caused his death?
I think that I would be surprised if the jury was persuaded by that. The prosecution kind of headed it off before the defense even really got a chance to make the case. They had all kinds of medical experts who said that the levels of drugs in his system were not enough at that moment to have caused an overdose or heart failure. And they acknowledged that he did have a long-term opioid addiction problem. But I think the general conclusion of the medical experts was George Floyd would not have died at that moment if there hadn't been a bunch of policemen on his back. And I don't think that the defense were persuasive in overcoming that.
Yeah. What is your sense of how long the jury may take to consider this verdict?
I think that's a really good question, which obviously everybody here is asking.
Yeah.
Will we be back in a few hours? You know, my suspicion is I would be very surprised if he walked away without being convicted. He might get manslaughter, but I think a lot of people will be surprised and very angry at that. My suspicion is it might be quick if the jury's decided that he's convicted on the most serious murder charge, which is second-degree murder. It might be long if the jury divides over whether it's second or third-degree murder. And the difference there basically hinges on whether when he was on George Floyd's back, that was a criminal act in itself. Second-degree murder is basically causing George Floyd's death through a criminal act, which would be the assault being on his back. And third degree will be he caused it, but he wasn't committing another criminal act in doing it. Jury might disagree over that one.
Yeah, they may struggle for that distinction. How high, Chris, are the stakes in this case for the city and more broadly across the United States?
Well, I think they're very high, you know, as we've seen from last year. I mean, this reinvigorated the Black Lives Matter movement. That 9 minutes and 29 seconds of video of Derek Chauvin, the police officer, on George Floyd's neck is excruciating. It's horrifying for those that have seen it. And it was repeatedly shown in court over and over again, which must have had its impact on the jury. But Americans saw it, and it's been widely viewed. And I think the idea that the officer responsible for that would just walk away would have some quite serious repercussions. And on top of that, of course, we just had another police shooting of a young black man, Daunte Wright, in just south of Minneapolis in a place called Brooklyn Center. So the city was already on edge is more on edge than it was before.
Indeed. You know, you pointed out that during the trial for the prosecution, there were people across all races and ages showing their horror and disappointment at what happened to George Floyd, or devastation more than disappointment. Do you think it's going to help beyond this trial, given, as you pointed out, there was just last week another shooting and many other instances coming forward of this ongoing fear that black people have for their lives, just going about their daily business?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, on the one hand, you had the police chief and Chauvin's police colleagues testifying against him, and there was a sense perhaps that kind of blue line solidarity, police protect each other, might have been broken by this case. And I think that perhaps is true, although there is another view that the police chief in particular was testifying to save his department, the reputation of his department. But I think more broadly, no, there isn't a sense that this trial is going to change very much, because policing It's changing, but it's not changing fast. And the fundamental problems of policing aren't really going to be addressed by sending one officer to prison. I mean, there's some very important structural issues in policing. And one of the outcomes potentially of the Chauvin trial is to say, well, he wasn't following his training. So by doing that, you're not even acknowledging that the training is a problem. And I think most Americans would think training of American policemen is a big problem.
Yeah, terrible one. Great to get your observations, and we will watch as it unfolds. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.